We have another long-time BC Natural Resources Forum supporter all the way from the North Coast of British Columbia. Would you please give it up for Mr. Ken Veldman, Vice President, Public Affairs and Sustainability, Prince Rupert Port Authority. Oh, come on, you can do better than that. Let's, Ken. Good to see you, bud.
Yes, it's me again. Thank you, Kevin. On behalf of the Prince Rupert Port Authority, certainly grateful for the opportunity to continue our long-time engagement with the BC Natural Resources Forum. Important program to discuss opportunities, issues that are fundamental to the economic future of not just northern BC, but the province as a whole, and indeed, I would argue, the country as a whole. Our port operations take place on the traditional territory of the Samoyed-speaking and Tsimshian people, with whom we have built a strong track record of sharing economic prosperity. For example, 38% of the port industry's workforce are of Indigenous heritage, which actually exceeds what the local demographics are for our local labour force. First Nations-owned businesses have delivered almost $500 million worth of construction projects over the last 10 years, building critical port expansion infrastructure. These are examples of what we believe sets PRPA apart: our commitment to both commercial and community relationships, innovative approaches to collaborative solutions, and recognizing those elements as critical pathways to success. The Port of Prince Rupert shipped nearly 25 million tons of trade last year, a large portion of which are natural resource exports from communities throughout northern BC. The port's volume represents over $50 billion worth of goods, and moving those goods to and from global markets generates over $1.5 billion of annual economic activity right here in northern BC, and thousands of permanent jobs in communities throughout the region, whether that be on the water, in terminals, on rail, on truck, or in logistics and warehouse operations. The port right now is at a critical juncture, and we are focused on actively expanding the services, capacities, and capabilities required to continue to grow and diversify and capture opportunities that are in front of us. In 2024, we are advancing over $2 billion in projects that will develop large-scale export transloading infrastructure with our partners Raymont Logistics, and new energy export facilities with our partners Vopak and AltaGas. Smart choices will ensure that we remain on the leading edge of our business, creating the most competitive supply chains for BC and Canadian exporters, while remaining true to our sustainability goals, including the reduction of what is already the lowest carbon intensity of any West Coast gateway, and something that we're quite proud of. Today it gives me great pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce a person who, in his role as Minister of Energy and Natural Resources, is playing a critical role in shaping Canada's economic and climate policies in a dynamic period. We're really pleased that he's joined us here at BCNRF, hearing directly from industries and communities relevant to his portfolio, and I know that he will be prepared to listen, to work hard on pursuing opportunities and resolving issues that we're discussing this week. Minister Wilkinson has deep roots in BC, including a home and family in North Vancouver. He has a significant private sector background, holding leadership positions with a number of companies dedicated to the development of green technologies. He was first elected to the House of Parliament in 2015 and has held ministerial posts for Fisheries and Oceans and Environment Canada before his current role, and in all of those roles has done significant work in British Columbia. We're looking forward to hearing Minister Wilkinson here today. Thank you for your time.
Bonjour tout le monde. Je suis très heureux d'être ici aujourd'hui. I am very happy to have a chance to be here to say a few words and to have a chance to talk to many of you. I actually was in Winnipeg yesterday. I would say it's actually balmy here relative to what it was like in Winnipeg. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting on the traditional ancestral territory of the Lheidli Dene First Nation. We talk a lot about climate change these days for obvious reasons. Climate change is altering our world's environment in a myriad of harmful ways. The planet is increasingly effectively burning up. The world's top scientists have been saying this for decades, and people everywhere have seen it in the floods, the wildfires, and the storms. This past summer, as you folks will know very well, we experienced the most destructive wildfire season in Canadian history. It forced the evacuation of thousands of people. It destroyed homes and livelihoods. It blanketed our cities and towns in smoke, and it put our brave first responders at risk. But the wildfire season was also instructive. It showed us what the future is going to look like if we fail to address climate change. Beyond its increasingly significant environmental impacts, climate change is also rapidly transforming the global economy and global finance in ways that are creating economic opportunities for those who approach the transition to a low-carbon future in a thoughtful, determined, and strategic manner. The global energy transition that is already well underway is both an environmental imperative to protect our planet for future generations, but it is also an economic opportunity on the scale of the Industrial Revolution. In releasing the World Energy Outlook 2023, Dr. Fatih Birol, the Executive Director of the International Energy Agency, stated, and I quote, "The transition to clean energy is happening worldwide and it's unstoppable. It is not just a question of if, it is a matter of how soon." The majority of Canadians are indeed worried about climate change, but they are also worried about their own economic situation, and they want to know that they and their children will have jobs and economic opportunities in the future. I am here to tell you that for Canada to seize the extraordinary economic opportunities enabled by the transition to a net zero economy, we must accept the scientific reality of climate change and ensure that that informs our economic strategy going forward. Today, I want to say a few words about how we build a better Canada through the thoughtful development and implementation of a green economic plan, a plan based in large measure on a natural resource and resource-enabled economy. A plan that is not based on wishful thinking, a plan that takes the world as it is, accepts the future that looks most likely, and looks to make it work to help our people and companies seize the opportunities that are indeed before us. Such opportunities are already being increasingly reflected in consumer and in industrial behavior. Consider just a couple of things. In 2020, 1 in 25 vehicles sold globally were zero-emission vehicles. That number jumped all the way to 1 in 5 this past year. So within 3 years, from 1 in 25 to 1 in 5, that is enormous, amazing progress. More than 500 gigawatts of renewable energy generation are set to be added in 2023 alone. And more than $1 billion US a day is being spent on solar deployment. Going forward, the IEA projects that by 2030, global demand for oil and gas and coal will peak in this decade, even in the scenario where policies around climate change do not get stronger. And in fact, as folks will know, total petroleum consumption is already declining and has been for several years in most major advanced economies. Almost half of the world's electricity supply will come from renewables, and 80% of all new electricity capacity that is added between now and 2030 will be renewable. The energy transition is being fueled in part by financial markets that are increasingly playing a role through the investment decisions that they are making, focusing on those assets that are consistent with long-term prosperity in a low-carbon world. And governments around the world, friends and competitors, are increasingly taking action. We look to the south. With the Inflation Reduction Act, the Americans are moving. That is similar to what is happening in Europe, to what is happening in Japan, to what is happening in Australia, where they are putting in place strategies for accelerating clean industrial growth. And beyond our democratic friends, countries like China are also moving very strategically. In 2022, China accounted for over about half of wind and solar additions globally, and they have now become one of the largest deployer, developer, and manufacturer of those technologies. They are now over half of global electric vehicle sales, and they are now one of the largest manufacturers of electric vehicle technology. and China presently dominates global critical mineral supply chains and associated processing. China has made a major bet on the energy transition, and it aims to be a leader in technologies that are central to it. This is something that must be a wake-up call for those politicians in Western countries that continue to pretend that future prosperity lies in simply pursuing pathways that the energy transition is fundamentally disrupting as we speak. La bonne nouvelle, c'est que le Canada est extrêmement bien placé pour saisir les opportunités qui seront cruciales dans la transition vers un monde à faible émission de carbone. We have, in this country, a well-educated and highly trained workforce, vast natural resources that are increasingly going to be in demand, innovative energy and clean technology companies, technologies, and expertise. We have trade agreements with major economies around the world, and we have banking, political, legal, and regulatory systems that are stable and are predictable. What Canada needs at this moment in our history is a thoughtful and ambitious economic strategy that will create wealth and good jobs in every region of this country. This is something that your federal government has been focused on since being elected in 2015, and I would say that the Green Economic Plan for Canada has kind of 5 specific pillars. The first is to identify and aggressively pursue key sectors that will be areas of significant growth in the context of a transition to a low-carbon future. Areas like critical minerals and associated supply chains, not just extraction, but processing, battery manufacturing, and product manufacturing, hydrogen and hydrogen production technologies, carbon capture, renewable electricity, biofuels and biomass, high-value forest products, including very much mass timber, and nuclear technology and associated supply chains. Canada is blessed with enormous economic potential that can be realized in a low-carbon future. I would actually suggest that Canada is perhaps one of the countries most advantaged in the world in that regard. But potential is only potential. We need thoughtful collaboration between industry, labor, Indigenous leaders, and levels of government if we are to create the hundreds of thousands of good jobs and the economic prosperity that is within our reach. Here in BC, the federal government has partnered on the development of a resource-focused economic strategy with the province and Indigenous leaders through the BC Regional Energy and Resource Table. We recently released a collaboration framework for this table that identified 6 key priority areas: critical minerals, electrification, hydrogen and clean fuels, high-value forest products, carbon management technologies, and regulatory efficiency. Alongside this framework, we announced over $100 million in investments in BC's green economy, including in clean energy and fuels, sustainable forestry, and electrification projects. And today I am pleased to announce further federal investment of $13 million in 2 forestry transformation initiatives and 6 clean energy projects across the province. This includes $4.5 million for Kalesnikov Mass Timber's robotic processing line project in South Slocan, which will drive mass timber products further up the value curve, and $500,000 for Dyson Joinery's wood fiber stabilization projects in Kamloops, which involves an innovative wood stabilization process suitable for underutilized species and large logs that are typically difficult to process. Among the 8 projects for clean energy, we have partnered with the Haine-Gwatiin Nation on 2 initiatives that will reduce reliance on diesel and build out clean power systems. The second pillar of the economic plan is to have a thoughtful approach to Canada's oil and gas resources. Forecasts suggest that oil and gas will begin to decline within 10 years and will continue as we see more deployment of lower carbon technologies like zero-emission vehicles. So the transition from the combustion of fossil fuels is underway, and it will take place over decades, not tomorrow, over decades. It is important to be aware, though, that how oil will be used will also change. Post-2050, in a net zero world, we will not use significant amounts of oil in combustion applications like cars and buses, but we will continue to use it in areas like the non-combustion applications like petrochemicals and lubricants and solvents, carbon graphite and waxes. And for such applications, reasonable volumes of oil will continue to be required even in a net zero world. Similarly, for natural gas, uses will exist beyond 2050 in non-combustion applications such as the production of ultra-low carbon hydrogen. At the end of the day, the most significant cause of climate change, as you know very well, is carbon emissions from the production and the combustion of fossil fuels. We need to move to reduce and then to largely eliminate the unabated combustion of fossil fuels over the period between now and 2050. We also need to focus on the elimination of emissions relating to production to ensure that those volumes of oil and gas that continue to be used post-2050 in non-combustion applications or abated combustion applications are compatible with a net zero future. During the coming 30-year period of transition and beyond 2050, when we have largely eliminated fossil fuel combustion, countries that focus on producing hydrocarbons with ultra-low production emissions will have the opportunity to grow their share in what will be a declining market. Aggressive action to reduce emissions from the production of oil and gas is thus critical for the competitiveness of any producing country that wishes its resources to be relevant in the context of a low-carbon future. The third pillar of Canada's economic plan is to build more clean power, a lot more. Yes, we need to reduce the emissions in the sector. That's not obviously a big issue here in British Columbia, but it is for a number of provinces. But as we think about the electrification of transportation, of buildings, of a range of industrial processes, increasingly many companies are looking for access to clean power as a key element of where they're actually going to locate their operations. It is going to drive demand for significantly more electrical energy, clean electrical energy. It will demand a decarbonized grid that will be double the size of the current grid by 2050. There is an enormous amount of work that will need to be done to get there. The fourth pillar of Canada's economic plan is the meaningful engagement and active participation of Indigenous peoples. The government is committed to advancing reconciliation across the country. This very much includes in the natural resource sector. It is why we recently announced we will be implementing an Indigenous loan guarantee program that will ensure that Indigenous peoples have access to low-cost capital to be able to actually partner with companies on projects that are taking place in their traditional territories. This is important as a matter of social justice, no doubt, but it is also required that we better align interests going forward to ensure that we can move forward in an expeditious way. And finally, the fifth element is we have to make our regulatory and permitting processes more efficient. It cannot take us 15 years to permit a new critical minerals mine if we want to successfully prosecute the energy transition. That is true not just at the federal level, that is also true with the provinces and territories. The federal government has been looking internally very closely at how we can actually make our processes more efficient, and I expect we will have something to say in the relatively near term in terms of a number of measures that we will be taking. But we also have to be working with the provinces and territories to ensure that we are better aligning federal and provincial processes. We should not be asking companies to do the same kinds of things for different levels of government. One of the areas that we are focused on with British Columbia under the regional tables is indeed regulatory pilots to align the work that we are doing, particularly as it relates to critical minerals. But that is certainly something that needs to be a focus on a federal-provincial basis and will be a focus for us going forward. The 5 pillars that I've outlined form the basis of a resource-based green economy that will promote jobs and competitiveness and economic prosperity for Canada in a low-carbon future. We have been investing significantly over the course of the past number of years, approximately $200 billion since 2015. Most significantly, most recently, were the investment tax credits that we have committed to introduce for a range of areas going forward. We did that in the last budget. And we are seeing significant economic progress from these investments right across the country. In Newfoundland, Brea Fuels is converting its refinery to renewable diesel. In Nova Scotia, Everwind Fuels recently received approval to build North America's first facility to produce hydrogen from renewables. In Quebec, we have seen progress with new lithium mines and the announcement of a major hydrogen project. In Ontario, we are seeing massive investments in the electric vehicle value chain, including in battery production. In Saskatchewan, BHP is constructing the largest and one of the lowest emission potash mines in the world. Companies in Alberta are developing net zero and low carbon industrial facilities, including Air Products' clean hydrogen facility, and the recently announced Dow $12 billion net zero petrochemical facility, the first net zero petrochemical facility anywhere in the world. And here in BC, we recently announced a $1 billion investment at the E1 Moly battery facility that will create 500 jobs and will generate further employment in upstream activities. And I actually was just touring before this, the Tidewater renewable diesel facility here in Prince George. Investments like these and the jobs and prosperity they will create are not happening by chance. They are enabled through a comprehensive approach that includes key regulations, incentives, investments, and other policy signals, including the price on carbon pollution. By way of closing, it is up to us as a country to make smart choices. We can choose to lead by recognizing where the world is heading and aggressively pursuing major areas of economic opportunity, or we can bury our heads in the sand, pretend the world is not moving rapidly towards a cleaner, greener future, eroding our competitiveness and our future prosperity. I call the first a green economic plan for the future, one that is thoughtful, one that is relevant, and one that is strategic. And I call the second simply hoping for the best, taking effectively a gamble on the future of the planet with Canada's current and future prosperity. We have clearly chosen the first path, and I would invite our colleagues in other political parties at the federal level to do likewise. We need to ensure we have an approach that actually addresses the climate issue, no doubt, but it needs to be done in a manner that actually also considers how Canada can build the economy that it needs to do it. Mr. Poilievre sits across from me in the House of Commons, and to date he has had very little to say about either of those issues. He is fond of using the slogan, "Technology, not taxes," as a description of a plan. But that's not a plan, that's a tagline. It is not a strategy. As a former clean tech CEO, I was in the clean technology industry for over 15 years. I can say very confidently that technology itself will not drive billions in new investments and bring new opportunities to countless communities. And technology on its own will not allow us to successfully address the existential threat of climate change. To do this, we have to put in place the conditions that will enable technology development, enable demonstration, and ultimately enable commercial deployment. I say all of this not as a partisan. I'm actually probably one of the least partisan members who sits in the House of Commons. I say this as somebody who believes in science, as a business person who has spent the last 25 years looking to help address the climate challenge in a manner that is consistent with future economic prosperity. And I say this as a parent who is simply unwilling to close my eyes and leave unimaginable challenges for the next generation. I would also say that it is extremely important from my perspective that we find pathways through which there is a greater degree of policy certainty at the federal level. In a democratic system, you have to expect that there will be changes in government. That's what the democratic system is fundamentally about, is about people having choice. But we have to find a way in this country to have less differences between political parties on issues that are so fundamental if we want to see the kinds of investments that we require if Canada is going to compete effectively with the United States, with Japan, and with China. Ladies and gentlemen, we British Columbians and we Canadians indeed have a choice, and I would suggest that thoughtful people must conclude that we simply must choose to thoughtfully act, and indeed, we must choose to have the courage and the foresight to lead. I invite your active participation in this important conversation and this important work in building a thriving and prosperous economy for the future of British Columbia and the future of Canada. Je vous remercie de m'avoir accueilli ici aujourd'hui. Merci beaucoup.
Right, this thing is working. To the Tulikadane Masicho Snechalia. I thank you for what you've done. And thank you, Minister. You took up some of our time for questions. So here's the thing. We met a couple of times, but one of the first instances I knew you had a bit of a sense of humor was late night during PDAC, and you were at the Intercontinental trying to get a glass of wine, and I accosted you, and you looked both miffed and kind of scared at the same time. Until I mentioned, look, I actually just want to introduce you to these two mineral processing companies, and your eyes literally lit up because you're like, flotation devices. And you guys like started yapping like 2 or 3, I think it was 3 of you, as if you were trading stamp collections or something. Anyways, it was pretty cool to watch. And thanks for coming here. So we have a limited amount of time. What I'm proposing to do is do like two big questions and then some rapid fire ones building off what you've said. So let's start with the message that you've been consistently communicating since you were first elected, namely Canada's and indeed the world's convergent interest is to collectively reduce emissions in order to ensure there is economic prosperity, more importantly, social stability. And in pursuing this common interest, your language of love to date has been to talk about economic opportunities like you've just done. And you know that federal leaders, provincial leaders, industry leaders, which includes the Indigenous leaders in the crowd today, all need to collaborate to achieve net zero. You've been optimistic in the progress you've been making at the regional energy and resource tables in all provinces except for one. And the question is, are the issues raised by Saskatchewan unique? And I'm not talking about the challenge of Saskatchewan, but the issues raised by Saskatchewan unique to this province? Or is this something you're hearing more broadly from other provinces? And can you share what some of those issues are and beyond the challenge of the political differences?
Well, I would say Canada is a very unique and complicated country. It is one where the cultures and certainly the economies of different provinces and territories are quite different. And each of the provinces have different sets of challenges in the context of the fight against climate change, and they have different sets of opportunities. My view is that, Canada works best when Canadians work together. That's what the regional energy and resource tables are about, are essentially conversations with every province, and certainly with Indigenous leadership. Here in BC, it's a fully tripartite process. I would say that certainly Saskatchewan has some unique challenges, particularly as it relates to the electricity grid. They're still significantly dependent on coal-fired power and have been moving towards gas. And we need to be sensitive to that. We need to ensure that we are thoughtful about how we work with Saskatchewan. At the end of the day, getting to a net zero grid is in the interest of everybody, very much including the government and the people of Saskatchewan. I would use the BHP example as a very strong point on that. I mean, BHP just announced the second phase of the Jansen Potash mine, $7-8 billion investment. The only way they were willing to do that was the federal government had to commit to working with them on being able to self-generate clean power, because they can't use the power off the SaskPower grid. They have to account for it in the products. So each province is different. I am interested in engaging conversations with every one of them. It's been most difficult for with Saskatchewan. I say that with great sorrow because I grew up in Saskatchewan. I used to work for a premier in Saskatchewan because the politics have unfortunately gotten in the way. But I would say with Alberta, people may hear things in the media, but we actually have a very productive working group with Alberta that is actually working on exactly some of these issues. So.
And just building up very quickly on that, just how important is the consensus across the provinces in helping us make progress on our climate and economic goals? I'm thinking about that vision of a transcontinental infrastructure that's required. So how do you bring them into the conversation? Because we are going to fail if one spoke of the wheel or whatever analogy you want to pick doesn't really work with us.
Yeah, I mean, look, it certainly is a lot easier if you have an ability to collaborate effectively. And I would tell you that with virtually every province and territory, perhaps with one exception where there have been more challenges, and even there, what the conversations that happen not in the media are a bit more productive than what people might imagine. But it certainly is much easier if you are able in this country to have that kind of active collaboration. We are a federation. We have constitutional obligations, some of which reside with the federal government, some of which reside with the provincial government. There certainly are elements where we actually do need to see more collaboration between provinces. I would say the electricity grid is probably one of those. Although I would say that in the short term, I think each of the provinces is focused on trying to figure out how to fill most of their needs internally rather than actually doing it externally. But there's lots of benefits around stabilization that you can have if you can actually figure out a way to get more of the way interties between, BC and Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, et cetera.
So let me build off what you just said. In the past 2 weeks, you've had the enviable task of being to Winnipeg, Saskatoon, and now Prince George. You guys can applaud for him for actually being in all those three places. The cold snaps are hitting many of these places, and they've stirred up the debate again about energy security, echoing some of the issues that you might have heard, or definitely would have heard during the period when Russia first began launching its war against Ukraine. And for example, you have many LNG proponents here. The Nishka are here. LNG Canada is here. And LNG is widely seen as an important potential contribution to global emissions reduction, a development opportunity that can deliver important benefits to BC and to the nations, and a tangible contribution, I might argue, to Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy. How is the government factoring in our own and our allies' energy security in the development of our net zero policies, including in the emissions cap on oil and gas?
Well, that's a broad question. I would say energy security obviously is critically important, and it certainly was underlined by the brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine. And we certainly worked very hard with our friends in Europe and our American friends to try to figure out how to best address that. I actually chair a working group on European energy security for the International Energy Agency. But I would say we need to be thinking about how we actually ensure energy security at the same time that we are thinking about how do we actually address the climate issue, at the same time that we are thinking how do we actually benefit from an economic perspective out of doing that. It's not either or. The science of climate change isn't going away, and the issues around energy security aren't going away. So I would say that's an extremely important conversation. It's one that we are having both domestically and internationally on an ongoing basis. Certainly in the context of LNG, it will play a role in the context of that transition. LNG Canada will be starting up in the reasonably near term. And there are a couple of other projects that are moving ahead. At the end of the day, the way that LNG fits in the context of global energy policy going forward is we actually have to minimize production-related emissions so Canada can make its progress on addressing climate change. We have to do it just like every other country has to do it. And we have to tie it to emissions reductions in other countries, like in Japan. And that has to be clear. It can't be displacing renewables. It actually has to be displacing coal if it's going to have the kinds of climate benefits that people think. But yes, it is absolutely an important opportunity, and the Government of Canada has been very supportive.
I can't believe you trusted me with one more question, but I'll do it. That question will have 3 parts.
Oh, no.
Okay, no.
Any lawyers in the room here? We need
You've got the best lawyer on the stage, man. What more do you want?
One question.
All right. So, and in all seriousness, I understand the time commitments here. Impact Assessment Act, you've already referenced the fact that permitting can't take 15 years. And I know some of the amendments are going to come into at least play because we have to address the Supreme Court decision. Are we hoping to address some of those more fundamental challenges by spring 2024, part 1? National Benefit Sharing Framework. Next steps budget 2024, but are they going to be next steps, or is it going to be an announcement that you can go to market with next year? I'll do 2. That's it. Go for it.
Yes, we need to move forward expeditiously with amendments to the Impact Assessment Act. We obviously respect the decision of the court, and I would hope to be in a position by the time of the budget to be able to actually talk about exactly what those amendments will be. But I would say the issue with respect to regulatory efficiency doesn't just relate to environmental assessment. It actually relates as much or more to permitting processes, which often take much longer even than the assessment process.
DFO.
Yeah, and the Fisheries Act authorizations are part of that, for sure. And to your second part of your question, and then I will stop, is the National Benefit Sharing Framework is something that we are working on. I would say at the federal level, a key and perhaps the most important part of that is the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program. I am certainly very focused on getting to the point where we actually have the details available within the next few months, and that we can actually move to the point where Indigenous communities can actually start to access those funds.
Thank you. You should give us more time next year. Just saying.
We leave that to our audience, but you two did a fabulous job. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Sharon. And just have a seat for a minute, because I'm going to ask Jamie Grant, Operations Manager, Groundbirch Shell Canada, to come forward and thank both you speakers. Give it up for Jamie.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank Chief Logan and the Lheidli T'enneh First Nation for hosting us all here this week. Thank you, Minister Wilkinson, for your time and your perspective today, especially on how Canada and British Columbia can prosper through the energy transition that's well underway, and the 5 pillars that you outlined in a resource-based economy. Also, thanks, Sharon, for excellently leading through the conversation at the end. Canada and BC share a rich history of responsible developing energy for Canada and the world, a rich history that Shell feels immensely privileged to have been a part of. We are all incredibly grateful for the role we and everyone in this room has played and will continue to play in sharing the province's energy future as it evolves to meet the changing needs of the growing world that we discussed during this panel. Thank you, Minister, and Sharon, for your words and insights today.
And Jamie, you can join the Minister and Sharon for our photo, group photo, while they are posing for Jason's camera. Let me tell you, we're going to take a little break soon. We're coming back for lunch at 1 o'clock, so listen for the bell. Sponsored today by CLAC, and it features a keynote speech by Chief Trevor McAday of the Doig River First Nation. So you can go for a little bit of stretch. We're going to ask you respectfully to clear the area for our Civic Center staff so they can set up for lunch. One more time, thanks to Minister and Sharon.